Hello, my name is Rebecca Parks. I'm a University of Lynchburg psychological science major, and I'm excited and honored to be sharing my preliminary results of my research that I'm conducting with my faculty mentor, Dr. Lang, and it is titled Correlates of Adherence to CDC Guidelines and Susceptibility to COVID-19 Related Myths. So, individuals have varying responses to public health crises, such as the one that we are going through right now, with various health guidelines imposed as well as stay at home orders. Life has quickly changed. And we think it is beneficial to understand what factors relate to individual differences in adherence to guidelines and beliefs about the disease. And we hope that becoming aware of these factors can help policymakers, school officials, and other influential leaders shape how they present important information about the virus. So before we go any further, I would just like to do a quick overview of the order of events. So we will first review current literature on COVID-19 behaviors and personality. Next, I will introduce the current research procedure. Then we will discuss the preliminary results. And finally, we will discuss these results, their significance, and what our future plans of study are. So, what factors are associated with COVID-19 related behaviors? Researchers have begun to study relationships between personality and demographic factors on COVID-19 related behaviors. So, Ashwaubenon et al. 2020 found that personality traits were more predictive of COVID-19 behaviors and attitudes, more so than demographic variables such as age and sex. These researchers explained that the traits of neuroticism and conscientiousness are the most relevant predictors of health-related behaviors in general. And sure enough, they found that higher conscientiousness was associated with more COVID-19 precautions taken. Surprisingly, they found that higher neuroticism was related to less precautions taken, but further analyses suggested that this effect was driven by depression. Next, Zajankowski et al. Studied correlations of positive and negative frameworks of personality on compliance towards governmental pandemic restrictions. So for their positive framework, they used the popular Big Five personality test, and for the negative frameworks, they used dark triad traits. And their findings indicated that agreeableness was the Big Five trait that was associated with greater compliance, while being rivalrous, power-seeking, and caring little for others was correlated with less compliance. So, in addition to the need for citizens to follow health-related guidelines, health officials also face the challenge of myths and conspiracy theories being spread about the pandemic, as well as the pandemic becoming a political discussion in addition to just a public health crisis. So, Giorgio et al. Studied variables related to susceptibility to COVID-19 conspiracy theories, and they found that lower levels of education and extreme left or right-leaning political beliefs were associated with higher proneness to COVID-19 conspiracy theory beliefs. So to introduce our current study, we measured which predictor variables correlate to current adherence of COVID-19 CDC health guidelines. The primary purpose of our study was to investigate what factors may influence COVID-19 attitudes, which in turn likely influence behaviors such as adhering or not adhering to CDC guidelines. We hypothesized that individuals higher in openness and conscientiousness, lower in entitlement, and higher in critical thinking, and less susceptible to COVID-19 related myths will have highest adherence to CDC guidelines. So 63 students from our small liberal arts college participated in the study through a Google form. They were recruited through a recruitment email sent out by various faculty members. The average age of participants was 19 years old. There were 51 females, 10 males, and one gender nonconforming individual. 52 participants were white, 5 were Black or African American, 3 were Asian or Pacific Islander, and 2 were Hispanic or Latinx. So participants completed the following questionnaires and scales, and I will briefly explain what each of them are. So we have our demographic questionnaire, Then we have the COVID-19 related CDC guidelines scale, and that was the same scale in both the current adherence and then the future adherence that you see more towards the bottom. We included both because the second was taken after a manipulation of a news article that participants read, but we are not going to focus on that manipulation in this presentation. We're just talking more about their susceptibility to myths and personality factors that relate to adherence. So we also looked at the California Critical Thinking Scale. Some sample questions from them participants did. And for personality, participants took the 15-item Big Five personality questionnaire, as well as the Honesty Humility subscale of the Hexaco, which is another common personality test. And the last two scales participants took were the Psychological Entitlement Scale and the Me versus Other scale. And we used these because we also thought this would be an additional personality factor that would be interesting to study. So here is what our susceptibility to COVID-19 myth scale, what some of the items look like. So the two at the top are examples of myths, and the bottom is an example of a true statement. And we originally had 30 items, but they were narrowed down to 21 after we ran reliability statistics. So the procedure is basically what I talked about before. The order of events are the same as these questionnaires here. So we found some significant results that we are excited to share. So the first was that there is a significant difference in the trait of openness between two groups of low and high adherence to CDC guidelines. We used an independent sample t-test and found that individuals who had higher scores on COVID-19 adherence had significantly higher scores on openness than individuals who scored lower on COVID-19 adherence. Next, we found two major findings about susceptibility to COVID-19 myths. So the first was that their susceptibility to myths and entitlement scores were positively correlated. A Pearson's correlation was conducted to determine the susceptibility to COVID-19 myths and to determine if it is associated with entitlement. And as we can see here, a positive correlation between the two variables was found. Going back, our other finding was that conservatives scored significantly higher on susceptibility to myths than moderates and then more than liberals. So as we can see here, conservatives had the highest mean score of susceptibility to myths, followed by moderates, and lastly by liberals. So to share some extra findings that were not significant but are interesting to look at in future studies was that although we did not find statistical significance for susceptibility to COVID-19 myths and critical thinking scores, it was in the negative direction that we hypothesized. So even though it was not statistically significant, we saw, as we hope to see, that the higher one has in critical thinking, the lower they will be susceptible to COVID-19 myths. Additionally, there were no gender differences between the dependent variables, but we also have to remember that we had a small sample of only 10 males and one gender nonconforming individual. So individuals low on openness prefer familiarity over change, and they prefer the aspects of life that are straightforward, while conversely, individuals high on openness prefer thinking about complex ideas, and they're more willing to embrace change. So finding that individuals in our current study had higher levels of adherence who also had higher openness, that seems intuitive. These individuals may be more receptive to the growing and changing understanding of the novel pandemic, and thus are more accepting of these evolving safety guidelines. The second major finding suggests that individuals higher in entitlement may be likely to view the pandemic as either inconvenient to themselves, they may view imposed guidelines as false narratives, or they might just avoid learning about COVID-19 if it is not directly impacting them, so thus scoring lower and being more susceptible to COVID-19 myths. Lastly, implications for the relationship between political party and susceptibility to COVID-19 myths are intriguing. It suggests that the messages from politicians may influence the attitudes and susceptibility to pandemic-related beliefs of followers. So, in addition to political affiliation, the demographic survey assessed where participants receive their news. And interestingly, but perhaps not surprisingly, Instagram was the highest reported news source of participation. Other interesting findings indicate that around 64% of participants know of someone who had the virus. And we have to remember that our study is taking place well into the virus compared to Ashwaubenon et al., who studied it in the beginning of March. So it is interesting to see how attitudes of the pandemic may change based on knowing if someone has had the virus or not. So these are some of our preliminary findings, and we are excited to do further studies and show more. Thank you for listening.